The reserved list is a list of cards that Wizards of the Coast has promised to never reprint. That is, potentially legally binding. This has caused a whole host of problems, and there are many complaints about how scarce many of Magic's best cards have been made by this decision. So today, we're going to be talking about the exact opposite. Reverse list cards that no one would be caught dead sleeving up for a tournament. And starting things off at number 10, we have Chronatog. This is a 1/2 Atog with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. You pay 0 to give Chronatog +3/+3 until end of turn, but you skip your next turn, and you can only activate this ability once a turn. Now, if Chronatog could be activated over and over again, it would actually be pretty good, as you could make it a creature of any size by repeatedly skipping future turns. Then use something like Fling to finish off your opponent. This would get around the downside of skipping all those turns by ending the game immediately, and would have been pretty powerful. However, the card does have this restriction, and as a result of that, is basically entirely worthless. Eating an entire turn for a stat boost is, obviously, a massive downside. That makes basically any card with this effect not worth considering. There are a lot of reasons for this, but one is that anytime you skip your turn, you're basically giving your opponent another card to use against you. Let's say you attack with Chronatog and your opponent blocks with a Grizzly Bear. Now, you could use its ability to make your Chronatog bigger and kill the Grizzly Bear in combat, which would not only take a card away from your opponent, but put you ahead on board. However, your opponent will get to take an extra turn where they'll draw another card and get more mana to cast spells, letting them replace that card and catch back up on board. This is only an average use case, and in it, you'd probably be losing out on this deal. The only time Chronatog is worth using is if you're getting in for the last 4 damage, which so many other creatures can do far better, even for the same mana cost. Even just a Stormcrow will likely do more damage in a game thanks to its flying. Chronatog may be one of the most useless creatures around, but you could still do a lot worse. And at number 9, we have Ertai's Familiar. This is a 2/2 illusion with a mana cost of 1 and 1 blue. It has phasing, meaning that during your untap step, if it's phased in, it phases out, meaning that it's treated as if it doesn't exist. If it's phased out, it phases in instead. It has the abilities where, if it leaves the field or phases out, you mill 3, and you can pay 1 blue to make it so Familiar can't phase out into your next upkeep. Now, before we analyze this card further, it is worth pointing out that at the time Ertai's Familiar was printed, a 2/2 for 2 in blue was actually considered a bit above rate. However, just because this was slightly better statted than other blue creatures at the time, that doesn't make the stat line actually good. Phasing is one of the worst abilities Wizards has ever made, as only getting to use a creature every other turn means that they have to be at least twice as strong as they would normally be to see play. Familiar sort of gets around this by letting you pay to keep it around, but having to pay a blue every turn to keep Familiar from leaving is pretty awful. This really ruins your mana curve, especially if you ever happen to stumble on land drops. There is the milling ability, which could be considered an upside in certain decks, but it's pretty lackluster as a way to mill your own decks as well. You have to wait 2 turns to mill 3 cards at a time, which isn't all that great for a 2 mana card. This is important because, as we just discussed, Familiar is so bad at being a threat that trying to use it to mill yourself is probably its best use case. It's another card that gets beaten out by Stormcrow, except this one is far more complicated and asks for more mana and attention to even attempt to use. And at number 8, we have Keeper of Tresshorn. This is a 6/6 avatar with a mana cost of 5 and 1 black. It is the ability where, when it attacks and isn't blocked, it deals no combat damage this turn, and the defending player loses 2 life. This is a card that's kind of hilarious to look back on nowadays. In the modern day, we get cards like Giantosaurus and Moltani and Yargle that have ridiculous stat lines for their mana costs, but are generally awful cards because stats alone aren't enough to make a 5+ mana card good. You at least need a few keywords to give the card a bit more oomph. Now, a lot of this is because of power creep, and if these cards were ported back into alliances when Keeper was printed, people would probably play them just because there were so few good creatures at the time. But stats alone at a high mana value have never been that good. This all goes to explain that, even if Keeper didn't have this downside, it wouldn't have been overpowered, even this early in Magic's history. Jazam Jin had almost the same stat line for 2 less mana and a less harsh downside, and that was the second set of the game. However, not only does the Keeper have a downside, it's also a terrible downside that basically completely kills the card. There are 1 mana creatures with 2 power, and those can end the game just as fast as Keeper can. Your opponent really can just ignore Keeper if you ever try to attack with it, because it's dealing so little damage each turn. The best thing that Keeper can do is block, and paying 6 mana for a blocker that can't even stop flyers is just pitiful. It's really a head scratcher as to why they thought this was necessary for a 6 mana creature with ever so slightly better stats than most 6 mana creatures at the time, but it makes a card that would be completely forgettable into something totally laughable. And at number 7, we have Avizoa. This is a 2/2 jellyfish with a mana cost of 3 and 1 blue. It has flying, so it can't be blocked except by flyers or reach creatures, and it has the ability where you can pay 0 to give Avizoa +2/+2 until end of turn, but you have to skip your next untap phase. You can only activate this ability once per turn. This is obviously pretty similar to Chronatog, but it has a slightly less bad downside. It doesn't really matter that much though, because skipping your untap step is still almost as devastating as skipping your whole turn. The main difference is that you just do get to draw a card still, but your creatures won't untap so you can't attack with them, and your lands will still be tapped from last turn. It's bad for basically all the same reasons that Chronatog is bad, but this time you're paying twice as much mana, and you get a creature that's not really that much better for the mana. It does fly and has 1 more power, but a 2/2 for 4 mana is so bad that flying alone just isn't enough to save it. Again, you'll basically never be using the ability to pump the creature. So a huge part of how you have to analyze these cards are based on just what you get when you cast the creature, and nothing else. Unfortunately, there's not too much extra analysis that we can do here. Avizoa is very similar to Chronatog, and we already know why that card sucks. Asking for twice the mana to even get the creature onto the field is really just adding insult to injury. And at number 6, we have Call to Arms. This is an enchantment for a mana cost of 1 and 1 white. It is the ability's where, as it enters, you choose a creature and an opponent. All white creatures get +1/+1 as long as the chosen color is the most common amongst the player's permanents. And whenever the chosen color isn't the most common color amongst permanents the opponent controls, you have to sacrifice Call to Arms. This is essentially just a take on Glorious Anthem, which is a pretty good card. If Call to Arms works, it's more than fine as a card. However, Call to Arms suffers from restrictions that make it wildly inconsistent. For one, it will trigger and make you sacrifice the card if the number of permanents of the color you choose and the other color are ever tied. This means that if the number of permanents of that color is 0, then you have to sacrifice the card. So before you can even cast the card, you have to wait for your opponent to have at least 1 creature or enchantment or something on board, so you can choose its color. This can be really awkward, especially against opponents who are only playing a couple of important creatures. If all your opponent plays is Sheoldred the Apocalypse or a card like Heartfire Hero, which they're going to stack a lot of buffs onto, then you really won't have a choice but to remove that creature or just lose. This is even worse against control decks, as they usually only commit something to the board once they're in a winning position. You'll basically never even be able to cast the card until you've already lost the game. And that's a situation you'll run into a lot with Call to Arms. Even once you get Call to Arms into play successfully, your opponent will have a ton of counterplay to this card. If they're on a 2-color deck, they could easily change their plays to force you to sacrifice Call to Arms on a lot of board states. If your opponent ever does find a way to out Call to Arms this way, or if you end up with it rotted in your hand, then the card is basically an active detriment. Call will fail to do anything so often that it usually isn't worth playing, even though it can be quite strong onto the right board states. And at number 5, we have Bazaar of Wonders. This is a world enchantment with a mana cost of 3 and 2 blue. It is the ability's where, when it enters, you exile all cards from all graveyard, and whenever a player casts a spell with the same name as a card in a graveyard or a non-token permanent in play, you counter that spell. Bazaar is a, well, bizarre effect that's pretty difficult to actually play around. The main problem is the high mana cost of Bazaar, as it takes a very long time to actually get the card into play in the first place. The idea would be to combine Bazaar with cards like Millstone to fill your opponent's graveyard with as many cards as possible to try and shut off as much of their deck as you could. But this plan is kind of ruined by Bazaar's Enters ability, which will undo most of the work you've done in the game so far to set up your opponent's graveyard. This can also backfire on you pretty badly. While you will probably be using the same amount of mill to try and set up your opponent's graveyard, you're probably going to be playing a lot of removal and board wipes to try and slow down the game. This means that your graveyard is going to be getting full of instants and sorceries pretty quickly, even after resolving your Bazaar, which can easily backfire. There's a good chance you'll end up locking yourself out of playing some pretty important removal spells at key moments. You could try and get around this by playing fewer copies of all your cards, or even going singleton, but at that point you'd be lowering the quality of the cards in your deck so much that you'd lose most of your games automatically. Not to mention that the card is completely useless in Commander thanks to the singleton nature of the format, where otherwise this kind of strategy might actually work thanks to the slower games. All of this combines to make the card extremely unwieldy and generally less useful than it seems. The most mileage you'll get out of the card is just using it as a Tormund's Crypt for 5 mana, which is as awful as it sounds. And at number 4, we have Gravebind. This is an instant for 1 black. It has the effect where target creature can't be regenerated this turn, and you draw a card during the next turn's upkeep. Regeneration was an old ability that has since been phased out. Essentially how it works is that when a creature was regenerated, it would get a shield that made it so the next time it would be destroyed this turn, it is instead tapped, removed from combat, and all damage is removed from the creature. Now, even in its prime, regeneration was a pretty uncommon effect. While you did see it here and there, it wasn't something you would really be concerned with. Even worse, there were multiple things working against Gravebind's usefulness. For one, a ton of removal back in the day, such as Wrath of God and Terminate, already had anti-regeneration clauses baked into them. The main use case for Gravebind would be casting it, then using a removal spell on a creature with regeneration ready to go. And with a ton of removal, this was just completely unnecessary. This also goes for any exiling removal. So if you're packing Swords to Plowshares or the newer Leyline Binding, Gravebind is still completely useless. However, the final nail in the coffin for Gravebind, at least in the modern day, is that it doesn't even work against the few cards around that actually do regenerate. Maybe one of the only regenerating cards that you'd still even consider for play would be something like Thrun, the Last Troll, which is a 4/4 for 4 mana which can't be countered, has hexproof, and can regenerate, making it almost impossible to interact with. Even if you did have a fatal push with Revolt Up and Gravebind to combo and take care of Thrun, its hexproof makes it so that's not going to happen. Is this ever going to come up? Well, no, but you're also not going to have any other creatures that are regenerated in modern games anyway. The best the card can do is simply be a cantrip that lets you dig further into your deck. But since you have to wait until the next turn to draw anyway, it's not much better than any other cantrips, even the limited ones in black. Gravebind is a complete failure at every level, but at least you can cast it and draw something better, which is more than what some cards can do. And at number 3, we have Marjhan. This is an 8/8 Leviathan with a mana cost of 5 and 2 blue. It is the abilities where it doesn't untap during your untapped step, and it has the Island Home abilities, meaning it can't attack unless the defending player controls an island. And if you ever run out of islands, you have to sacrifice it. You can pay 2 blue and sacrifice a creature to untap Marjhan, but only during your upkeep. And you can pay 2 blue to deal 1 damage to target attacking creature without flying, but Marjhan gets a -1/-0 until end of turn. And here we have the obligatory Island Home inclusion. While flavorful, making it so that you can only use the creature against 1/5 of all of your opponents is kind of a big downside. This alone already kills the use cases of the card enough, but they really went above and beyond in trying to make absolutely sure that the card would never be good by stacking more and more downsides onto this already bad card. After attacking with it for the first time, you'll have to pay mana and sacrifice an entire creature every single time you want to swing, which is far too high of a cost to pay every time you want to attack with what's effectively a vanilla 8/8. The only thing the card really does is allow you to deal some damage to attackers with its second activated ability. But paying 7 mana just to get access to the ability isn't exactly great, especially since it also makes Marjhan a worse blocker at the same time. There are a ton of blue cards like this, with Leviathan and the like flooding early sets with terrible, fat fish that no one would ever consider playing. Marjhan is the worst of the bunch that appears on the reserved list, but this is by no means the only card like this early on in the game. The fact that Wizards kept printing these cards despite none of them ever seeing any play early on in the game really makes you wonder what they think the game was like back in Magic's earliest day of competition. And at number 2, we have Energy Vortex. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 3 and 2 blue. It is ability where, as it enters, choose an opponent. At the beginning of your upkeep, you remove all Vortex counters from Vortex. And during your upkeep, you can pay X to put X Vortex counters on Energy Vortex. At the beginning of the chosen opponent's upkeep, they either pay 1 or take 3 damage for each counter on Energy Vortex. Now, this is a card that may not read all that bad when you first look at it. After all, paying 1 mana to deal 3 damage to your opponent is pretty good, and being able to do that over and over again sounds amazing. However, once you analyze how this card would actually go down, you start to realize just how bad this ability actually is. How this works in practice is that you pay 5 mana to get Vortex in play. Then on your next turn, you can pay any amount of mana to put counters on the card. Then on your opponent's next turn, they have a choice. For each of those counters, they can just pay 1 mana or take 3 damage, whichever is less bad for them, and then pass back to you, and all those counters go away. Essentially, what Vortex really lets you do is pay 1 mana to maybe make your opponent pay 1 mana. But because your opponent gets to decide which one happens, the impact of this choice will always be quite low. The worst part is that, because you paid 5 mana to get Vortex into play, your opponent can respond to the next turn by playing a creature, and then you're in a terrible spot. You'll probably need your mana on that turn to go back in the game, but if you're using mana on spells, you're not putting counters on Vortex, which means that you're not getting anything out of your 5 mana investment. You could use something like Doubling Season to put more counters on Vortex, but if you get Doubling Season in play and have 5 more mana to spend on your spell, you could do far better than Vortex. Casting a Vraska Betrayal Sting allows you to just kill your opponent right away, for example. Energy Vortex is a card that requires other cards to really do anything, and even then, what it does isn't all that crazy. And at number 1, we have Divine Intervention. This is an enchantment with a mana cost of 6 and 2 white. It is the abilities where it enters with 2 intervention counters on it. And at the beginning of your upkeep, you remove an intervention counter from Divine Intervention. When the last counter is removed from intervention, the game is a draw. It's hard to really even do an analysis of this card, because the problem is just staring you directly in the face. Generally, when people evaluate cards, you evaluate them based on the number of games they'll win by playing the card over another. Because intervention causes a draw, the answer to that question will always be 0. You cannot win any games with intervention. So, by the standard way of evaluating cards, it may be literally the worst card in all of Magic. At least cards like One with Nothing, that are usually actively detrimental, have some edge cases where you could try to argue they're worth using. But to even try to argue for intervention, you have to stretch so far people will probably mistake you for Mr. Fantastic. Now, if we move past that massive card destroying issue, the card isn't even good at what it's trying to do. Not only does it cost 8 mana, you then have to wait 2 turns for the effect to finally go off. And all this time you're waiting, the card is doing absolutely nothing for you. Even getting to draw a game with Divine Intervention is quite hard, which means that it can't even be used as a panic option. Theoretically, you could use Intervention as a way to get another game in a tournament setting if it's looking like you're about to lose. But since the card is so slow, your opponent will end up winning the game anyway. Divine Intervention isn't just a card that does something that no one would ever want to do, it also does that thing poorly. It is one of the most hilariously terrible Magic cards ever designed, and that's probably for the best.